Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second session of the My Path to Independence in HIV Research series. I welcome everybody, and I'm very happy to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Lisa Bowleg. First of all, I want to say that Lisa will cover a different area of HIV research from our previous session, which was basic science. Today we will talk about social behavior science. And I know that there's a lot of junior investigators working in this area at DCCFAR and in our institutions. First of all, let me remind you that the goal of this series is to introduce you to careers of HIV investigators, successful careers, so that junior investigators in DCCFAR can actually relate to it and maybe compare their what they're doing to advance their careers to what other people did successfully, and actually think about your goals and the ways you approach them. Lisa is really a scientist who she actually graduated from GW in terms of her PhD. So she's our alumni, and this is also a nice kind of circumstance. But most importantly, since her PhD degree in 1997, she really built up her career to really very high levels. So now she is an established investigator in social behavior sciences. She is a co-director of our social behavior science core at DCCFAR. She published a large number of papers, over 50, I believe, made a number of presentations at different forums, and received several awards, including, for example, just last year, Trachtenberg Prize for Research from GW. So she really represents a person who built up her successful career, and what actually is very important in HIV research since her PhD, which was also devoted to HIV science. So she stayed in this area for almost 20 years, over 20 years now. So Lisa, we're very happy to see you talking today and hear your presentation. Please do it. We look forward to it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction. Let me just. Do you see my main screen and not my notes?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation in particular, and I thank the Developmental Corps for this invitation, and in particular Vivian Kirkham, who you're the long-suffering associate for trying to coordinate this. So I'm really excited about this talk. It gave me an opportunity to reflect, and I always tell my team that if I think something's going to take 4 hours, it's going to take 40. In the case of this, when I was asked, I was like, oh yeah, sure, I'd love to do it. That's easy. I don't even have to prepare. But then I went down this memory lane that I'm going to show you in a bit. And so this, what I thought would be, oh yeah, that's a snap, it was more like 400 hours. But here I am. So I'm just going to jump in. I only have 40 minutes. And so I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm just going to tell you. So my path to independence in HIV research. This, as anybody who's been at one of my presentations also knows, this is the shortest title I've ever had, and that's because I didn't choose it. But I'll jump right in. So my path starts here, and this is really important. I was born and raised in the Bahamas, didn't come to the US until college, and I'm a descendant of the Black Seminoles, and basically the Black Seminoles were this group of people who formerly enslaved people in the US, who left the southern plantations, traveled to Florida, and then joined Seminole Indians and intermarried with that group. And then in 1821, when there was the first Seminole War, and they said, okay, we've just had enough of these white people torturing us. We are going to Andros in the Bahamas. And Andros, as you see here, is the largest island in the Bahamas, and it's where my family's from, Red Bay. And so the Black Seminoles, and they call themselves Black Seminoles, and they're not Native Americans, but Black, formerly enslaved people. And they managed, 200 of them fled Florida and managed to live in Andros in relative isolation for 150 years before they were discovered. And so that's sort of my proud roots. I'm very much still tied to the Bahamas. Everyone in my family lives there, for example. This is our flag: black for the people, aquamarine for the water, yellow for the sun. And that's really important. All of my research focuses on Black people. And the picture on the right is just how stunningly gorgeous of a country it is. I have now lived more than half my life in the US, and I go back to Nassau, where I'm from, many, many times a year, and I am still stunned by the natural beauty. So in terms of thinking about this path, I want to start, of course, with my family. And this is my mom, who was a hematologist and worked in the sciences, but I'd be lying if I said that's how it started. But I grew up in this upper middle class for the Bahamas family where, my father has an MBA and worked in, had several of his own businesses. This is my high school graduation, and a prominent person missing from this is my sister, who would come 12 years later. So she shows up in other photos. But to my right is my grandmother, who is, her name was Rosalie Smith, but everybody called her Mommy Rosie, which I named her because I was just crazy about her. And thought, and she said, okay, so you can act like you have two moms, but she is really an important part of my story because she was this beloved English teacher. And so she taught all of the leaders and all that. And so she was also my first editor. And so as I'm writing and she's editing my work and critiquing it, and I'm entering all these different writing competitions, and she was absolutely instrumental in that. And so to my left is my paternal grandmother, Nana, we called her. That's my father, John, my mother, Dory, and my younger brother, who is a hydrologist. And by the way, a proud graduate of Howard University. So graduated in 1983, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so my mother, being the good Caribbean woman, said, well, guess what? You not just staying in our house, you will get a job. And so I got a job at a bank doing like administrative stuff. And this was way before computers. And so it's like typing stuff into blocks. And that was a really important step in my trajectory. I knew I was going to college, but I wasn't exactly sure. That job made me get out of there like I was on fire, because it's where I learned I hate the structure of 9 to 5. Of course, the irony of a professor is you work 100 hours, but it was you got to be on time, and I was in trouble all the time because I wasn't on time. And then the PSAT, I want to be a social psychologist, is part of the family story. When my mother was moving me to my first job as my first assistant professor job at the University of Rhode Island, she was going through all of my scrapbooks. I've always kept photos and scrapbooks, and she shrieked. She said, oh my God, because at the PSAT, which I think I would have taken in grade 10, not sure, apparently you had to list a vocation or something, and I had chosen that I wanted to be a social psychologist. I'm pretty sure I did not know what a social psychologist was, but that's what I chose. And well, here I am, I'm a social psychologist. So my professional path really sort of is sort of overlapping, and I'm going to sort of walk you through this because it seems like it's been this very divergent and unconventional path, but one that I'm so proud of now, because I think it's all sort of all of these different pieces fit together to make me the investigator that I am. As for my educational path, I was a psych major at Georgetown and graduated in 1988. And then I went on to do a master's in public policy with concentration in women's studies at GW and got my master's in 1992. And then I graduated from the same program in which I now work, the Applied Social Psych program. And so I'm going to talk you through this. So instrumental to my journey has been this woman. This is Margaret Stetz, who then was a professor of women's studies. And I took my first Intro to Women's Studies course with her at Georgetown. And so this is 1986 or her 1986. And it was transformational. I just learned how to think critically. It's one of the reasons I often tell sort of everybody, if you want to learn how to think critically, take a women's studies class. The other thing that Margaret was absolutely instrumental in my life was introducing me to the work of Black feminist leaders. And I, in fact, did an independent studies with Margaret, and these were some of the books that I was reading. And so this is where the word intersectionality hadn't sort of come into play. That would come into play like around 1989. But I was reading all these sort of critical Black feminist writers talking about, in essence, intersectionality and the intersections of racism and sexism and so forth. And so this is, Margaret has been foundational to my life. She also was the one who got me writing and who thought it would be a pretty good idea for me to be an adjunct. And so shortly after graduating from Georgetown, I was teaching Intro to Women's Studies. I taught Psych of Women. I taught a course on HIV because I was doing HIV work. And so Margaret is a near and dear mentor to me. So this is what it looks like for me at Georgetown. This is me in graduating and just, some Georgetown photos. But so I graduate, and there's this idea that I know I'm going to do doctoral work in psychology. It felt like I was being sort of, at that time, when people think of psychology, they think about clinical psychology. That just didn't seem right for me. But somewhere, somebody had told me that I'd need some research experience. And so that's what I sought out. And so at the time, Caitlin Ryan was finishing up a study that I'd read about in the Washington Blade, which is the LGBT paper, and it was the National Lesbian Health Study. And so I wrote her and I said, typed her. I wrote her a letter. I'm graduating, and I understand that I'm going to need some research experience, and so on and so forth. And she wrote back and she said, well, that study is over. And so that was an important lesson. That's when I would learn about sustainability and funding. She says, but I'm doing some other work. I'm doing HIV policy work at the AIDS Policy Center, which is this nonprofit at the Intergovernmental Health Policy Project here at the George Washington University. And what we have available is a position for somebody who's sort of part-time administrative assistant. So, answering the phones and taking messages. I hated that part, but also doing some state analysis of HIV laws. And she said, and by the way, were you to take this job at GW, you would also get tuition benefits. And I said, that sounds fantastic. So I got the job. And she was also, she said she was really impressed with my initiative because I did not have much work experience, in this realm to speak of. And so this is Caitlin. That's me, top right in my office. And I mean, I know the photo is blurry, but it really sort of dates me. You'll see there a typewriter. You probably can't see the phone. That's the administrative job that the administrative part I just detested. This is Minnie Bruce Pratt, the great Minnie Bruce Pratt, a lesbian poet, famous lesbian poet, author, writer, who also taught in the Women's Studies program. And this is at one of our booths at Gay Pride at the Intergovernmental Health Policy Project. And you see those AIDS different publications I was writing quite a few of them at the time. And then this is a photo of my graduation. This is my graduation from the Women's Studies program, concentration in public policy with a concentration in women's studies. And you can see that my sister Janelle, who's a dear, not only my sister, but a really dear friend, has joined the picture. So I want to just sort of talk about the context of that time. So this is late 80s, and whereas today you can go for months and months and not see HIV on the cover, at the time that I was working and doing policy analysis, it was everywhere. It was in the newspaper, it was on Newsweek, it was just a sort of really poignant, ever-present, omnipresent presence, and also fear at that time. It was also a time of great political advocacy, by which I mean you could just go to the White House, which was just a few blocks away. My office was on K Street, and so I can just walk a few blocks away and see an act of protest. And that was really important to me because the Intergovernmental Health Policy Project, the sort of parent office of the AIDS Policy Center, had this sort of nonpartisan stance. Our job was simply to report what state legislatures were doing around HIV, their responses. And that was really not satisfying for me because I had this sort of critical lens from women's studies, and there was a lot to critique, particularly the way that particular groups, gay and bisexual men, particularly Black and Latino gay and bisexual men, women of color, sex workers, the way they were stigmatized, the way they were treated in law. And so I very much wanted an outlet where I could write in a critical voice. And one of the things that I did, and if it's not clear, I'm a classic overachiever. So I'm working full time, I'm in school, and I'm doing consulting work on the side with the Center for Women Policy Studies. And the Center for Women Policy Studies was just so well aligned with my values. This is from one of their documents, and basically, without using the word intersectionality, they are laying out how central intersectionality is to their mission, that all issues affecting women are interrelated, that sex and race bias throughout society must be addressed simultaneously, as policies and programs for women in general, minorities in general, are not enough. This is exactly the stuff that I'm still writing about now, years later, and the need to address diversity and the interconnections, and so sexual identity, ability status, age, and so forth. And so these are the types of publications that I was able to do at the Center for Women Policy Studies. In particular, I point your attention to the Inaccessible Miracles, Women's Access to HIV Medications. This was a study that we did with about 85 women, mostly Black and Latino, living with HIV. And this was at a time when everybody was heralding, oh, we have AZT, we have this. And we were talking to women who didn't even have refrigerators to keep their medication in. And so this is where I had a real sort of strong understanding of the structural barriers to health. And that's also a fundamental thread in my work. But even so, even knowing all of these sort of, how important structure is in terms of constraining the ability of people to engage in health promotion behaviors, I still wanted a solid grounding in social behavioral sciences. And that's what took me to this place, which thank God we are no longer in this building. The psych department has just moved to another building, but this was the building I was in for the longest time on G Street. And I was accepted into the doctoral program in applied social psychology. And this program was so wonderful for me in so many ways, and is also instrumental to my path. So I was interested, so I'm, still focusing on HIV, but very much with a social and behavioral science lens. And I wanted to just sort of show you these sort of three inspirations that really were foundational to the work I would do for my master's thesis and my dissertation. The first one is the 1988 is a paper by Mays and Cochrane, where they argued that so many of these theories that we used about risk perception and all that were really limiting for women of color. And they brought in issues of relationship power and poverty and this larger context in which we needed to understand HIV risk, and that it wasn't just about condoms and attitudes towards condoms. And similarly, they expanded on this in this 1993 piece. And so my life is pretty much summed up of being in it, but not of it, meaning in this case, I'm in social psychology, but always very critical of this sort of individualistic, purely social cognitive lens. And so that's a thread that runs through all of my work. And then Hortensia Amaro comes out with this Love, Sex, and Power about considering women's realities in HIV prevention. And I was like, that's it. That's the lens I want. How we understand HIV and sexual risk within this larger context of, in this case, power and relationships between women in heterosexual relationships, for example, and beyond just sort of, everybody should use condoms. Women don't control condom use. And so these are some works that were really sort of critical to where I went next. And so this is my master's thesis, very proper social psychology thesis, the role of self-esteem and sexual esteem and sexual self-efficacy on Black college women's potential HIV risk-taking behaviors. And I think we put potential because there was not, or at least they did not report lots of sexual risk. My dissertation was squarely within the realm of Hortensia Amaro's work about understanding gender roles, power and relationships, and sexual self-efficacy. And it was wild in the sense that I ended up doing this dissertation in a very truncated time because my advisor, Faye Belgrave, was leaving, and I couldn't envision not finishing my dissertation with her. And so what this entailed was quantitative. These are Black and Latino women. I am not a fluent Spanish speaker, but I had research assistants who collected who transcribed and translated everything into Spanish, back translated it, helped me collect the data from 5 different community sites in DC. So it was ambitious and it was wild, but it was an important part of my trajectory. This is my first publication from my dissertation, and the one that I got a job with. I mean, it is inconceivable today to think that you could get an academic job with one peer-reviewed publication, but that's all I had. I was working full-time, and so the publications I had did not count. Absolutely foundational and fundamental and inspirational to my journey are my mentors, and I saw Maria Cecilia join, and so I know she's on this call. So Leslie Wolf, who I've talked about, well, I may not have mentioned, Leslie was the executive director of the Center for Women Policy Studies, and so she is she's the portal for me to be doing this more sort of political writing and highlighting the structural barriers. The wonderful Faye Belgrave, who was my dissertation mentor and just, the best. And this is my GW crew, Carol Risen. This is my party after after graduation. The wonderful, wonderful Paul Poppin, the amazing Maria Cecilia Zea, who remains a close friend and colleague, and Faye Belgrave. And so I have the great privilege of having been mentored by people who were doing HIV work, just starting. Maria Cecilia and Faye would later go on to the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies, which I'll talk about in a bit. I took a course on risk-taking with Paul, and lots of the literature on HIV. And so again, there's just ways that I was always steeped in HIV work in one way or another. So then I get my first academic job at the University of Rhode Island in the Department of Experimental Psychology. I love this job. What they wanted is they were looking for a social psychologist with a focus on multicultural diversity and gender issues. That I think was how the job description was. And there's so many things. It was such a wonderful, supportive environment for someone like me, because they allowed me to just sort of do whatever I wanted to do. There was a very successful and well-funded research center on campus, doing a lot of HIV work, and they really understood why I did not want to work there, because it was a very sort of, the stages of change model, and I was much more interested in these sort of contextual factors. And so I really loved being at University of Rhode Island. So while there, during my first year there, Maria Cecilia and Faye tell me about the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies program at the University of California, San Francisco, and they are in the first cohort. And they said, we think, given your interest, you should apply. I'm forever grateful to them for the recommendation. It was one of the best experiences of my life and remain so. And were it not for this program, there's no way I would have become an investigator. I didn't know what an R01 was. I knew nothing about the world of NIH research in 1999. But this program was targeted to people like me, who were doing work in racial and ethnic minority communities. And the whole goal is this 3-year program. You would spend 6 weeks in San Francisco for 3 consecutive years. It was divine. Learning how to write an NIH proposal. And so you'd have a seminar just on the specific aims. And the first one I taught was taught by Susan Folkman, the Susan Folkman of coping fame. And it was brutal, it was challenging, but it was wonderful. The other thing that CAPS does is the peer review. Everybody's, your grant proposals go through this sort of peer review process. So you get all of this feedback aimed at improving your proposals before you submit them to NIH. This is also where I met Jean Tishon, who was my mentor at CAPS, and I describe our relationship as love at first sight. The importance of having a mentor who really gets you. And so, for example, one of the challenges I was having in this program is this program was designed to get you to write an R01. I'm worried about whether I'm going to get tenure because I don't have sufficient number of publications. So at night, I'm in the office, because I remember it so well, because I was in Kingston, and it's these fields I would look over and see the Amtrak train passing in the background. And I had several teary conversations with Jean about how I'm not gonna make tenure because of this publication thing. And my publications are getting rejected. I'm a really strong writer, but I'm doing qualitative work and I'm submitting into psychology journals. They don't know what I'm doing. And so they're rejecting it because of my small samples. And so Jean, and I should say something about all of my mentors, I'm in contact with all of my mentors still. And that's really important to me. Jean and I just had an hour-long conversation last week. Margaret and I are always in contact as well. And so, but my journey with HIV has also had a sort of a very personal side. This is my favorite picture of my Aunt Karen, and this is my mother's younger sister who was living with HIV and died during the first year of the CAPS program. And I remember this because I had to fly home to the Bahamas. And so that was always sort of sobering, that this wasn't just some sort of subject, but something that had somebody that was so close to me and that I admired so much, because I mean, look at her. She's, water skiing, and she was a flight attendant, and she spoke French fluently, and she traveled, and she was so, fashion conscious, and just, I just adored her. And so this is a really a poignant reminder then and still about the importance of this work. And this is, I delivered her the eulogy at her funeral that they ended up publishing in this book, Living the Light of Hope, A Nation Speaks of HIV/AIDS. So, but going back to my HIV work, I hit a really hard wall, and this part is particularly for the early career scholars, because there's a way, just as when you see a publication, right, and it's peer reviewed and it's perfect, and what you don't know is the number of revisions or how the editors revise, or the editors work so hard to make it a better paper. It's also the same with these careers. You see somebody who's sort of gotten all these grants and you're like, oh wow, and why can't I make it? So I really want to talk about some of the obstacles. So as I've hinted at before, one of my biggest problems was not having the right type of publications. I had a lot of publications from my policy work. So this is just a smattering of some of the reports that I was always, my job was constant writing, whether it was at the Center for Center for Women Policy Studies or at the AIDS Policy Center is churning out different reports, and a bunch of newsletter articles. We published the state AIDS report, where we would address how states were dealing with whatever issue in HIV. And so tons of this stuff, but I didn't have the publications that you need to be an investigator. And this came up for me twice. The first place it came up was my first R01 submission. And so I was at the University of Rhode Island, and I've submitted, and it's going to be clear why I got the Band-Aids. It was painful. So I wanted to do, it became very clear to me that so much of the research around HIV with women was all, focusing on women and what they should do and their condoms and all that. And I started to think, where are the Black men that they're having sex with in this equation? We know that HIV is much more efficiently transmitted from men to women in heterosexual exposure. So what do we know about Black men? And that's when I found out that there were very few studies focused on Black heterosexual men. And so I wanted to do a study where I would look at sexual risk for Black men within the context of masculinity and other factors, and social cognitive factors, because again, good social psychologists. And so I submit this first thing to the NIH. This is my first proposal, and oh my God, I describe this experience as, you have a scar and so it hurts, and you don't want people to really know, but they go right there and rip the Band-Aids off. So I wanted to share with you the critiques, two of the critiques about the investigator. So, because they took it there, and it's always reviewer two, right? But anyway, reviewer two. So one of the issues beyond the science was the fact that I lived in Philadelphia, even though I said in Rhode Island. I've never been destined to live and work in the same place. That still continues, but I don't have time to get into all that. But what I wanted to show is what I've highlighted here in red. And so, she's got some experience. However, her slim publication history is troubling for one who received her PhD in 1996. It was 1997, but still. This raises concerns about her ability to disseminate the findings of this work in peer-reviewed outlets. And reviewer number three, similar. The lead is a new investigator who seems to be active, but not necessarily a productive empirical scientist. She claims, I didn't like that, she claims 10 years of experience in the field, but reports less than one publication per year, often based on very small samples. So they're talking about qualitative stuff, or are conceptual, theoretical, or informal meta-analyses, and so on and so forth. So needless to say, the thing was not discussed, and I was crushed by this, because the thing that I was most sensitive about, this thing that I feared the most, not having the publications to cut it, these reviewers went there and just ripped the Band-Aid off. So then the publication thing comes up a second time, because then now I've decided, it's really glamorous when you're flying to work between Rhode Island and Philadelphia for the first year or so. And then that gets tired really fast. All of a sudden, it's late at night, you're cold, and you're dragging a suitcase behind you to the economy parking lot crying. And so I decided, okay, no, I can't do this commute anymore. I really want to be in Philadelphia. I want to be in a multi-ethnic urban environment. There were so many things I loved about Rhode Island, but trying to do research with Black people in Rhode Island was just impossible. So I get the job at Drexel. Oh, I should say, I did get tenure at the University of Rhode Island. But now I want to move to the School of Public Health. And the dean says to me, you look like a wonderful candidate. And Drexel really is trying to be an R1 institution. And I've been over and over your resume. We cannot give you tenure because of your publications. And so I had to give up tenure, and it was really an ego blow, but I knew I'd get tenure again. And also it was much more important to me to be in a city where I wanted to live. And so, these were some really tough times on the ego. Giving up tenure, people kill to get tenure. And so to get it and give it up. But that same grant that I had, the grant proposal that I had submitted, where they just skewered it, particularly the investigator, being in Philadelphia allowed me to allay a lot of their concerns. One of their concerns was, well, how are you going to do this grant collecting data in a city you don't live in? That was one. But what I also did is I made a concerted effort to boost my publications. And this is an email that comes through on a Friday in June, Mirabile Dictu, which means wonderful to relate in Latin. And it's from the program officer, the wonderful Susan Newcomer at the National Institutes for Child and Human Development, I think that's right, telling me they had a surplus of funds. And so they're going to fully fund that proposal. So that same proposal that was shredded, and there were some scientific concerns. They thought it was ambitious. Well, of course, I wrote it, but it gets funded, and this pretty much changes everything for me in terms of my trajectory towards independence. So these are all the logos from my different projects, my NIH funded projects, and the ones in the bottom, which I won't have time to go over, are current projects. And these are the ones in which I have been the sole PI or a joint PI. And then there's a whole host of other projects on which I am a co-investigator. And so if I had to think about, just generally sort of these sort of key insights, and the research is in general focused on Black men, and really trying to understand, because I learned in Represent that there was so much more beyond just these sort of individualistic social cognitive predictors, really bringing in context, this larger context of factors beyond the level of the individual, particularly the intersection of racism and heterosexism. And so that's a really sort of big part of my work. And so if I had to sort of distill what I've learned just generally from my HIV research, it would be that there is such a disconnect between what NIH prioritizes when it gives us these grants. They're interested in outcomes such as increased condom use, things like that, and Black men's social structural realities. And I'll sort of show you that in a bit. The need to expand the criteria for success in HIV prevention interventions just beyond HIV. For example, one of the most successful parts of an intervention in Men Count, which was a relationship-based intervention for Black heterosexual men, and it included counseling about HIV, was really the relationship they had with the peer counselor, and how their ratings of success for that were just through the roof. They reported increases in jobs and housing, but not so much. We didn't see significant changes in reported sexual risk, which from an intervention standpoint, the intervention failed. But from a large sort of life context, it was quite successful. The need for more community-led rather than community participatory social behavior and science research. There's something really wrong that investigators who don't live in the communities, don't know the communities in that way, get grants to go and sort of study other communities without having opportunities for the people who have that expert knowledge and that sort of grounded ties to community to get funds that we know are likely to be much more effective in terms of the types of interventions that they roll out, because they will be grounded in the needs and histories of their communities. We need unconventional approaches, the need for sort of qualitative and mixed methods and critical frameworks beyond just the mostly sort of conventional social cognitive theories that we learn in grad school, and that primarily individualistic social cognitive approaches are not going to end the epidemic for communities of color in the US. And so this is sort of an example of the types of things that NIH prioritizes. And, we want to increase condom use. We want to increase PrEP, surely. And we want people to have greater awareness of HIV risk, and we want people to be tested. But over and over in every study that I've done, the Black men are not talking about this. They are talking about larger structural factors that constrain their just ability for sort of quality of life, much less health. And so, as an example, this comes from Represent, the first study, and this is where I'm using intersectionality as a framework. And this is a quote talking about the inextricable link between unemployment and criminal records. And so what happens when you use methods that facilitate opportunities for participants to talk about their experiences in their lives. And so all of my studies have been mixed methods and always include an interview portion or a focus group portion. And these are the types of narratives that you get. And so this has been very important because my research has completely shifted just following what I've learned from participants. Another example is of Menhood, which is another R01 that I had that was funded by NIMH. I now have the luxury of forgetting who's funded my studies, which is a wonderful thing that I wouldn't have imagined possible years ago. And what we wanted to understand with this is this sort of neighborhood context of risk. And this was among Black men, mostly heterosexual, in Washington, D.C. And what's remarkable about this study is we did focus groups in, I think, about 8 to 10 different neighborhoods in D.C. We never asked one question about police. We never asked that directly, but this was an example, and this has come up in all of our studies, where we asked, well, where's HIV on your priority list? And what they said, well, we got more pressing priorities, and one of them is police violence, and what it means to be a Black man in the US, and the omnipresence or how ubiquitous harassment by police is. And so there's a way, again, NIH's priorities and the priorities of what participants tell me. So in sum, 6 lessons, there's many more, but they only gave me 40 minutes. 6 things that I've learned on this path to independence. Without mentors and DEI mentoring programs, this would not have been possible. Good mentors and DEI programs such as our CDEPI program here at CFAR that we're so proud of are just vital. And of course, the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies program that I've talked to you about. And in the middle is a paper that Maria Cecilia and I co-authored. Maria Cecilia graciously invited me to be a co-author on this about transitions in sustainability from mentor to independent research. And one of the things we talked about is the need for these sort of structured programs. It's not enough to just have mentors who say, oh yeah, atta girl, but really sort of programs that tell you how to do this and show you all of the sort of special sort of ins and outs and all the tips and tricks that you otherwise would not get. Were it not for these programs, I would not be talking to you today about this path. Were it not for the CAPS visiting professor program. The other thing is, the other essential thing, you need collaborators. And this was really hard for me in the beginning when I was a new investigator because I didn't have a team. But over time, if you're lucky enough to have the great collaborators that I've had, people like the wonderful Ana Maria Del Rio Gonzalez, then it means that when you find an opportunity, you already have a network and you have somebody that you've published with that you can bring into the fold. And I have just been so blessed at GW. Tamara Taggart is a co-investigator, and as was Shanika Hull before Shanika left for Rhode Island. You absolutely need amazing staff. And there's no way that I would have made it on my path to independence without this woman. This is the wonderful, I'm feeling emotional, Dr. Janae Massey. Janae was my project director. She was my first recruitment coordinator when I was at Drexel. So that's like circa 2008 to 8-ish or so. And then she became my project director. And it's because of her sort of holding down the logistics. There's so many logistics and administrative factors that go into any project that allow me to be as successful as I have been. And so when I was leaving Drexel to come to GW in 2013, I begged her, please come with me. And her saying yes was the best thing that's ever happened to me. And so, it's so easy to just see the person doing the presenting and whose name's on the publication. But without her, it would just be chaos. And so Janae has been absolutely instrumental to this path. And then just research infrastructure, having an office with somebody when you decide to write a grant proposal, that there's somebody to do the budget. You don't want me doing anything with numbers. I always say, the benefits of the unconventional multidisciplinary path, which I've already laid out. The other lesson, rejection, is part of the process. You might as well just embrace that. And I love this quote from Robert Sternberg about submitting grants and that people give up, right? When people give up if their application is not discussed. And as he says, they conclude that their research is just never going to be funded. And they're right. Their lack of persistence has guaranteed that they will not be funded. And so I've learned over the years to not be daunted by rejection. I just, I have my breakdown and I get back to work. And it has been really, it's paid off. The fifth thing I've learned is your weakness can be your strengths. And so if you remember, think back to reviewer number 2 about, most of her, she's not much of an empirical science. She doesn't have many publications. They're mostly conceptual, and turns out that's gone on to be a strength. These are the sort of, in terms of the impact of my work, I'm so proud of this. And so that what I lack in terms of quantity, I think I've I've made up pretty well in terms of quality. And you can see these are just Google Scholar citations that how frequently my work has been cited. These are my top 3 cited publications. So I'm immensely proud of that. And last but not least, the importance of trusting yourself and honoring your values and who you are, and honoring those who paved the way. And so for me, this is a photo of me and the great Audre Lorde, who described herself as a Black lesbian warrior poet, and wrote beautifully about intersectionality, and her work, particularly her Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House article, has been just so vital, a vital thread that sort of drives me to be courageous when I'm afraid. And so that is also a really important part of my story. And last, just a nod of gratitude of people who got me on the path, a list of people here. And I'm at the end. I will thank you and invite your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Very impressive talk, and I think it was really very very informative, and besides its entertaining value.
Thank you.
We have time for questions, so please, those who want to ask, raise the hand, or just unmute yourself if you can. I believe you should be able to, and ask a question.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you, Lisa. That was really well done and just very inspiring. And I particularly liked seeing all the people that you've co-authored with too, like Edna Ruel Fuentes was in there. I couldn't believe that.
Oh, Edna, yeah, we worked together at the Center for Women Policy Studies.
Yeah, and just you sharing all the kind of ups and downs and decision points in your career. It was really meaningful. I can't imagine how much time it took to like put together all those photos. And
that's what I'm saying. That's what imagine me in my basement over the last few days. Oh, I remember that photo, and just digging and digging. And that's why this turned out to be to take more time than I expected. But it was such a labor of love to just, because I haven't really thought about a lot of these.
This really was a privilege to listen to it. So thank you.
So hello, Lisa, this is Miranda. I'm a newest member to the DCC FAR. So I certainly appreciate hearing the backstory, right? The things you often don't see behind the scenes when you read someone's bio or you see their faculty page. So thank you for sharing that. Do you mind also sharing some of the backstory behind the Intersectionality Research Institute that you founded?
Yes, well, there are actually sort of two institutes. There is the one that I wanted to do at GW, and then there's also one outside of GW. So the one at GW, which is the Intersectionality Research Institute, is mostly housed and run by the indefatigable Janae Massey, is mostly a portal for our research, our intersectionality research. Several of those grants, I didn't have time to go into all of those, are intersectionality related. And then there's my Intersectionality Training Institute that is separate from GW. It's independent, and that offers training in the application of intersectionality to health equity research, and that's to researchers. Those are webinars and workshops, and we also host a free monthly intersectionality research salon. Those have been so much fun, where we invite people to come and just talk about what they're doing or grappling with intersectionality training wise. So that's, yeah, so I'm, again, overachiever. You can always account that I will have 5 million jobs all over the place. Thank you for asking, Miranda. And I think we have a meeting coming up, right?
We do, and I cannot wait.
I'm looking forward to it.
Lisa, this is Alan. Brilliant, just brilliant talk, and thank you for sharing so much of yourself and your life with so many of our investigators who want to be you and be like you, and like me, I want to be like you too. Could you talk a little bit about the balance of life, of the stress of having to produce article after grant publication after grant application, and how does a young person, a young investigator, maintain the balance that it takes to be successful?
One, they don't. It is a grind. The decision that I made was that I wasn't going to get on that wheel of just submitting and submitting and submitting. I saw a lot of that. And what I wanted is, I really wanted my publications to make a really strong contribution. I'm a perfectionist. It's a curse. It is a curse. But if you look at most of my publications, particularly my earlier ones, I'm the first author or the only author. And so it took so much time to sort of craft those. And I decided that for me, it would be more important to have quality over quantity. And I think that's a risky decision, because not every department chair or tenure committee is going to get that. And the other thing I realized early in my career was that I would always have to educate my reviewers. And so, meaning, I learned after I kept getting rejected from all of those qualitative publications, particularly in psych publications, that I would have to lay out why qualitative work is important and why it's different. And so I was doing a lot of that just to get through the gate. And likewise with promotion and tenure, I realized that I needed to tell the people who would be evaluating me why I do qualitative work, and that a 1-hour interview could yield 40 pages of text. And so for me, it was really about, especially once I realized there was going to be no way I could compete in terms of quantity. And so it was sort of a decision I needed to make. I mean, I have students from the University of Rhode Island, for example, I think, who went on to have to do postdocs, for example. They can run circles around me with the number of publications they have. And so I realized, no, that's not going to be it. But how can I be a new voice? How can I try and say something that I think is critical, that's different, that's significant? And so that was the calculus. And it was a risky one, but that's what I made. That's the one I made. As for balance, I struggle with that. I don't, this job, I mean, this is the madness of my not wanting to be in a 9-to-5, because I just don't want to show up at 9 o'clock, because I'm working on the weekends, I'm working in the evenings, but if you're passionate about the work and you happen to be cursed with perfectionism, it's just part of the gig. I hope I've answered your question, Ellen.
Absolutely, and thank you for your response.
Can I call on somebody?
I don't see questions. Let me ask you,
Oh,
since
okay, because I
there
want
is
to
a
call on
little
Maria
time.
Cecilia.
I just wonder whether for our junior investigators, you can really kind of provide a little more details on how you managed to change the mind of the NIH study section and grant you funding when they were so negative in the beginning. Maybe you can have some
yeah.
insights or something.
Well, so I addressed many of their concerns. And a big one was the Philadelphia, Rhode Island thing. And it was joyous to write, check, we don't have to deal with that. And I really spent time working on publications in the interim. I really prioritized that. And I probably, in my response, did a lot of the same type of explaining about, how my approach is different than conventional approaches. And there were lots of strengths, and I had a strong team. Jean was a co-mentor, and so I brought on senior investigators because I was so new. And so that also was convincing. They felt really comfortable knowing that I was working with senior investigators. That allayed a lot of their concerns. When they're, that this term they love at the NIH, curbed, our enthusiasm was curbed. And so when their enthusiasm for my application was curbed, I just was, as you do in any time, I was just in a peer review response. I was very responsive to the prior feedback. You have to be, if they tell you put a comma and tell them that you did so. All of that, I was just very responsive, and I got lucky. I was lucky. They had surplus funds. Maybe if they didn't have surplus funds, I wouldn't have gotten the grant. But I got it. And I remember the dean at the time at Drexel, she said, this is going to change everything for you. And she was right. And she was right. And I didn't understand that at that time at all.
So Lisa, since you called on me, I don't know if you had a particular question, but it's been wonderful to see your career. As the pictures attest, we were both very young. I was, of course, older, but you've done a wonderful job. And I think going back to Alan's question, I think having a balanced life is not that easy, except that you have the chance to go to Bahamas and replenish while you're there. Although I'm sure you're reading and writing and thinking, so probably you never have a quiet moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the one thing that I do have that served me very well is I do have lots of boundaries. Like unless I'm working on a grant, I'm not working when the sun goes down, because nothing good comes from that. I'm not on email all the time. I'm a very focused worker. I'm really a devotee of Cal Newport. If you don't know his book, Deep Work, or his podcast, Deep Questions, look him up. But I don't have the balance that I'd like. Not yet. I think that's called retirement. But I just wanted to see you and thank you for being visible, because you've been with me on every step of this journey. And I wanted an opportunity to thank you for everything, for our courses and for CAPS, because had you not been in that program, there's no way I would have known about it. And so thank you for all the ways that you've been generous, your generosity through me throughout the years, and being a colleague and a friend. What a pleasure it's been. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I guess we came to the end of the hour, and for those of you who want to ask Lisa questions, please email her or email to Developmental Core. We will relay your questions to Lisa. And I want to thank you, Lisa, again for the wonderful talk you gave, and for your participation today. Thanks. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Bye, everybody. Be well.
Bye-bye.